Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. The U.S. Supreme Court has approved changes that would make it easier for the FBI to hack into people's computers. The ruling would allow a federal judge to issue a warrant allowing authorities to hack into and seize data of electronic devices in any location, even if the user is using anonymity software like Tor. These changes will go into effect December 1st. Now, joining us now to talk about all of this is Jenna McLaughlin. She is a reporter and blogger covering surveillance and national security for the Intercept. Thank you so much for joining us, Jenna.
Thank you for having me.
So, Jenna, let's start off with what this amendment would allow authorities to do.
Sure, absolutely. So, firstly, the amendment, like you mentioned, would simply allow an FBI agent conducting an investigation to go to a magistrate judge, so a lower-level judge, and request a warrant to hack into potentially thousands of computers, no matter where they are. And this especially applies to in cases, especially like a recent investigation into child pornography, where those users are using Tor, so the agents don't know where the actual computer is and they don't know who it is. So their investigation is partly to reveal where that person is. And basically, this just gives them more jurisdictional leeway, pretty much. And they can kind of go warrant shopping. I've seen a few scholars say you can go to maybe the friendliest judge, and that warrant will authorize you to go throughout the country, maybe even abroad, to hack into different computers. So it's a big jump in power. And second, it would allow the FBI to hack into the computers of some victims of cybercrime. So what happens when there's a botnet is that a hacker can take over a whole bunch of different computers that sort of become zombies in order to send out malware, phishing attacks, things like that. And now the FBI would be allowed to sort of double that attack and hack into those computers for further evidence. So it's sort of like searching the property of a victim.
And how is this different from what they're already allowed to do? For example, they can attain a warrant to tap into your phones and access information and data. And the big case that was going on that Apple was trying to fight at this time was some of this. So how is it different from that?
Well, it's different because prior to this, a magistrate judge could not authorize a warrant for somewhere outside of his or her district. It wasn't allowed because of the territorial guidelines. A district judge sometimes can, depending on whether or not the court agrees with that decision. But a couple of cases actually involving the child pornography investigation that I mentioned were thrown out recently because the judge determined that because these rules were not yet in place and the warrant was authorized in a state that was different, that where the computer was searched, that the evidence did not count anymore.
Now, I understand that Ron Wyden, Senator, is trying to introduce a bill to counter this. He argues that this particular measure or amendment is going to allow a greater intrusion of our privacy. What does that bill contain, and why is he so fierce in fighting back?
Right. We're not quite sure what exactly the bill's text will say yet. I'm actually hoping to interview Senator Wyden next week about it, so that's great news. He has been working on this for a long time. He's sort of been warning that this rule change, this power change has been happening sort of outside of people's view because it's in such an obscure process to update criminal law that people just didn't really know about it. And he wants to make sure that Congress is in on that conversation. And also, he just wants to remind people that the idea of hacking when it comes to law enforcement is not necessarily something that's even had a congressional conversation yet, let alone the idea of expanding those powers. So that's something he really wants to call attention to.
Jenna, in the case of authorities trying to access telephones, like in the case of the San Bernardino terrorism case, or when they're trying to do it for security reasons, why not allow that to happen? Is there a risk in authorities having access to your computer when it's targeted in that way?
Right. So I think the important thing to remember in this is not necessarily that most people, including privacy advocates, think that this route of investigation is completely wrong. A lot of people think that it might be an appropriate way to do targeted surveillance, targeted investigations, but they want Congress to talk about it because there are certainly unintended consequences that can come from compromising someone's computer with malware, because it's hard to contain if it's not done properly. Those sorts of things can spread to other computers and infect other innocent people's computers. The FBI has impersonated the Associated Press in order to sort of conduct a phishing attack on a suspect at one point in time, and the Associated Press was not happy about that. So there are a lot of questions like that of, how do we regulate this and make sure it doesn't get abused, make sure the people who are doing it are very well trained, that it's conducted in a way that is targeted and there's oversight. I think that's sort of where the conversation needs to start. But I don't necessarily think everyone considers it, the nightmare possibility.
And what is the nuances around the encryption software and the fact that the FBI could still look into your computer in spite of the fact that you have encryption or Tor or other kinds of software that would prevent them from getting into it?
Right. Well, encryption sort of comes into this debate in the sense that there's always the possibility to get around it. Really strong encryption protects you very well, but there are instances when in targeted cases, you can exploit sort of a flaw in the software in order to basically see that person's computer after it's been decrypted. If I hack into a computer, not that I have the skills to do that, I would be able to sort of access emails that have already been decrypted on the other person's side. But it's challenging, and it's not like you have access to those things all the time. The FBI has sort of been requesting a method of lawful access to encryption that doesn't require hacking, it doesn't require penetration. But security experts around the world sort of unanimously have said that that's a terrible idea, just because it would create, a mandated flaw in the security that would be even easier for other people to abuse.
Right. And what are the concerns of security officials? For example, James Clapper has come out and said that in terms of national intelligence, the computer security is one of the biggest threats that we face today. What does he mean by that exactly, and what does this mean for us?
I think what he explicitly means by that is that cybersecurity is something that the U.S. is faltering behind on. It's something that countries around the world, including Russia, Iran, China, some of those places have state-sponsored hackers that can access our systems. And I don't think anyone's necessarily linked every single breach that has happened in the U.S. to a state sponsor, but we've had numerous high-level security breaches. And when security officials talk about that, they're usually saying the critical infrastructure, the government systems, the power lines, the hospitals, things like that. However, more and more, they aren't necessarily acknowledging, as a lot of information security researchers do, that the critical infrastructure is more and more connected to things like our cell phones. So if we're ignoring the security of our phones, things that are in critical infrastructure are at risk as well. We want to build up all of those systems. And I mean, just on your phone, you have plenty of private information, you have banking information, personal emails, personal messages, photographs, things like that.
All right, Jenna, I thank you so much for coming on the Real News Network, and I hope to have you back very soon.
Thank you so much for having me. Me too.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.